Paul Winters adjusted his tie in the department store changing room mirror. The charcoal suit wasn't designer, but it was the most expensive thing he'd ever bought. $850, a sum that would haunt his credit card bill for 3 long months. But tonight was different. Linda's promotion to marketing director at Crestview Innovations was more than a new title. It was the payoff for years of her ruthless ambition and his quiet, steadfast support. "You look sharp," the elderly attendant commented as he passed by. "Special occasion?" Paul gave a tight smile. "My wife's promotion celebration," he said, smoothing the lapels one last time. The suit was a luxury he could barely afford, but he wanted to look like he belonged in her new world. Linda had been teasing him for years that his wardrobe was stuck in accountant mode, whatever that meant. Tonight, he'd show her he could play the part. Driving to the lakeside hotel, Paul's thoughts drifted to last week in the kitchen. Linda had been hunched over her speech notes, barely glancing up when he offered to listen. "That's sweet, but unnecessary," she murmured, already lost in her next line. "It's just the usual, thanking Roger and the team," she said, fingers drumming the paper. "Don't forget to thank your amazing husband who kept you alive and sane through it all," he teased, leaning down to kiss her hair. She had smiled absently, a distracted, automatic smile that didn't reach her eyes. The lakeside ballroom was already buzzing when Paul arrived. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm light, making everyone look a little more glamorous. He recognized a few faces from summer picnics, but this crowd belonged to Linda. She was easy to spot. Her blonde hair swept up in an elegant twist, the deep blue dress they'd splurged on shimmering under the lights. She stood at the center of a circle of laughter, Roger Kessler's booming voice at the heart of it all. Paul ordered a scotch on the rocks and waited, glass in hand, for her to notice him. She hadn't been home since her morning meeting. Straight from clients to the hotel, she'd texted. "Save me from the receiving line," she'd written. "Just come to the main event at 8. It was already 8:30. He caught her eye across the room and lifted his glass in a small salute. She gave him the briefest of nods before turning back to her conversation. "First time at one of these?" the bartender asked, catching Paul's uneasy posture. Paul gave a rueful smile. "That obvious?" The bartender's guess was spot on. "Spouse of a Crestview employee?" Paul nodded. "My wife's the new marketing director." The bartender gave him a knowing look. "Let me know if you need another drink. These nights can be rough for the plus ones." Paul was on his second scotch when Roger Kessler tapped a knife against his champagne glass, silencing the room. The crowd turned to watch him at the small podium. "Tonight, we're here to honor not just a talented marketer, but a visionary who has redefined how Crestview connects with its clients," Kessler began. "In just 5 years, Linda Winters has boosted our market share by 23% and brought in over 30 million in new accounts," he continued, his words ringing with conviction. Pride surged through Paul's chest. He'd watched every step of that climb, the late-night pacing, the endless cups of coffee he'd brought her when she was buried in data. And so, without further ado, I'm proud to introduce our new marketing director, Linda Winters. Applause thundered through the ballroom as Linda stepped forward, radiant and self-assured. Paul clapped until his palms burned, grinning at his wife as she took the mic, even though she still hadn't looked his way. "Thank you, Roger," Linda began, her voice smooth and poised. "This promotion is the result of countless hours of work, not just from me, but from an incredible team." She thanked Roger, her boss Diane, several team members by name, and even Marta, the office manager. Paul waited, smiling, bracing for his mention, the small acknowledgement that he was part of her story. But that moment never came. "In conclusion," she said, "I'm honored to lead Crestview's marketing department into a new era of innovation and growth." The applause rose again, and Linda was quickly swallowed up by a fresh circle of congratulations. Paul stood frozen, his glass halfway to his lips, the sting of her omission sharper than he'd imagined. Had she really forgotten? Linda, who practiced every line of every speech until it was perfect. The realization sliced through him. It hadn't been an oversight. It was deliberate. He drained his glass and pushed through the crowd, weaving between executives and well-wishers. When he finally reached the edge of her circle, he caught her eye over the shoulder of a silver-haired man in a tailored suit. For a split second, something flickered in Linda's gaze. Recognition, maybe. Then, puzzlingly, Something like annoyance flickered in her eyes before she quickly turned her attention back to the silver-haired man, laughing at his joke and resting a hand lightly on his arm. She'd seen Paul and had chosen to look away. Ouch, a voice murmured beside him. That was cold. Paul turned to find a man about his age in a well-tailored navy suit, one eyebrow raised. You caught that too? Paul asked. Hard to miss, the man replied, extending a hand. James Harrington. Paul Winters. My wife's the guest of honor. James's eyebrows arched even higher. Really? That's interesting. What do you mean? Paul pressed. James hesitated. Nothing. Just office politics. You know how it is. He glanced around. Want to grab a drink? Bar's a little less crowded now that the speeches are over. Paul stole another look at Linda, who was still completely focused elsewhere, then nodded. Sure. As they waited for their drinks, James leaned against the bar. So, accounting, right? We're at Beckman and Associates. Nothing glamorous, but steady, Paul said. Nothing wrong with steady, James replied. I'm in construction management myself. Build things that last. That's my motto. Their drinks arrived, and James raised his glass. To the spouses. The invisible support systems. Paul clinked his glass, though the toast left a sour taste. So, James said after a sip, how long have you and Linda been married? 6 years. Together for 10. Paul replied. Karen and I just hit 12, James said. Met her when Crestview was still a scrappy little startup. You've been to a lot of these events, then? Paul asked. More than I can count, James said, studying him. First time being publicly snubbed? Paul stiffened. I wouldn't call it. It's okay, James cut in gently. We've all been there. The corporate spouse dance is brutal. But getting ignored by your own wife? That's a new level. She's just busy, Paul said automatically, though even he didn't believe it. James gave him a look of quiet understanding. Sure, of course. He took another sip of his drink. Karen used to be like that. So wrapped up in work she forgot I was there. We had to have a serious talk. Ended up moving out for a month. Paul nearly choked on his scotch. That seems drastic. James shrugged. Sometimes drastic is the only way to get through to them. These corporate types get so focused on the climb, they forget who's steadying the ladder. Before Paul could respond, a small commotion by the buffet table drew their eyes. Linda was there with Roger Kessler and the silver-haired man, all three laughing. Paul watched as Roger's hand rested on the small of Linda's back in a way that felt too familiar. That's Thomas Brighton, James said, following Paul's gaze. Runs Brighton Media. Big potential client for Crestview. They seem close, Paul said, keeping his tone even. James took another sip. Rumor is, Brighton's interested in more than just marketing services. What's that supposed to mean? Paul asked sharply. James gave him a look, then spoke in a careful tone. Just that Karen says Linda's been having a lot of late-night client dinners with Brighton lately. Always running behind schedule. Paul felt a cold knot form in his gut. It's probably just work. Probably, James echoed with a touch too much ease. But if it were my wife, I'd be asking questions. Before Paul could reply, a petite woman with short dark hair appeared, slipping her hand into James's. There you are, she said. I've been looking all over. She turned to Paul. Hi, I'm Karen. Paul, he replied, trying to sound casual. Nice to meet you. Paul's Linda Winter's husband, James explained, and Paul didn't miss the knowing glance between them. Oh, Karen's expression shifted to a gentle sort of pity. It's lovely to meet you. Linda's quite something at the office. The way she said it made Paul's stomach clench. We should head out, James said, finishing his drink. Early day tomorrow. He handed Paul a business card. If you ever need to vent, or just grab a beer, call me. They left, and Paul stayed at the bar, nursing his third scotch and watching Linda work the room. She never once looked his way, never reached out to pull him in. He felt like a ghost, like he didn't exist at his own wife's celebration. An hour later, he decided to try again. He approached Linda just as she stood with Thomas Brighton, their heads bent close in conversation. Excuse me, Paul said, stepping into their small circle. I don't mean to interrupt. Linda's smile wavered. Thomas, she said lightly, have you tried the canapes? They're by that new caterer I told you about. Brighton took the hint and excused himself, leaving Paul standing with Linda in the dimly lit ballroom. Linda, we'll continue our discussion later? Thomas asked, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Absolutely, Linda replied. I'm very interested in your proposal. As Brighton drifted out of earshot, Paul leaned in quietly. Congratulations again. Your speech was great. Thanks, Linda said, her eyes already scanning the room for her next target. Paul couldn't let it go. You forgot something in it, though. Linda finally focused on him. What? Me, he said softly. Your husband. The one who's been there for you every step of this journey. Her expression shifted from confusion to tight irritation. That was a professional speech, Paul. I was acknowledging professional contributions. So I haven't contributed? The anger in his voice caught even him by surprise. Who's been holding everything together at home these past 2 years? Who stayed up until 2 a.m. listening to pitch ideas? Who rearranged his life for your career? Lower your voice, Linda hissed, flashing a bright, artificial smile as a group passed by. When they were gone, her voice dropped back to a sharp whisper. This isn't the time or place. When is it, Linda? You're never home. And when you are, you're too tired to care about anything but work. Her eyes flickered over his shoulder, and suddenly her expression brightened, warm and practiced. Roger, I was just about to look for you. There's someone you have to meet. She brushed past Paul like he wasn't even there, greeting the CEO with effortless charm while Paul stood rooted in place, cut off, ignored, invisible. He made his way back to the bar, ordered a fourth scotch even though he knew he'd regret it. The bartender gave him a sympathetic look. Rough night. You could say that, Paul muttered. Apparently, I'm invisible. As the night wore on, Paul drifted through the ballroom like a ghost. When he tried to talk to Linda again at the dessert table, she murmured something about needing to check in with Roger and slipped away. But it was near the coat check, as the party began to wind down, that he heard it. Linda and Thomas Brighton were standing close, their voices low but intimate. The London proposal's almost ready, Brighton said. Just need to finalize a few details. Perhaps over dinner next week? Linda replied, her voice warm and easy. The Westfield at 8. They have private rooms, perfect for in-depth discussions. It's a date, Brighton said, his hand lingering on her arm far too long. Neither noticed Paul standing just around the corner, his coat in hand. He didn't wait to say goodbye. He simply walked out, the laughter and music fading behind him. Back at their apartment, Paul sat in the dark, still in his t-shirt and sweatpants, the expensive suit tossed aside. When the door opened at 1 a.m., Linda flicked on the light and jumped when she saw him sitting there. You're still up, she said, setting down her purse without meeting his eyes. We need to talk about tonight, Paul said, his voice calm but shaking with the weight of everything he hadn't said all night. Linda sighed, slipping off her heels. Can it wait until tomorrow? I'm exhausted. No, it can't, Paul said, his voice low. You treated me like a stranger tonight. No, worse than a stranger. At least you acknowledged the waitstaff. You're being dramatic, Linda said, moving to the kitchen to pour herself water. It was a work event where you thanked everyone but your husband, Paul said, his voice steady. Where you avoided me all night, and where you set up a dinner date with Thomas Brighton. Linda's head snapped up. You were eavesdropping on me? I was standing 3 feet away, he said. You were just too busy with Brighton to notice. Is there something going on between you two? That's ridiculous, Linda scoffed, though a flush crept up her neck. Thomas is a potential client. Of course I'm giving him special attention. Special attention, Paul repeated, his voice flat. Is that what we're calling it now? Linda slammed her glass down. What exactly are you accusing me of? I don't know, Paul said, his voice catching. But from where I was standing tonight, alone, by the way, it looked like you were embarrassed to be seen with me. Like I'm just an inconvenience you'd rather not deal with. That's not true, Linda protested, but her eyes wouldn't meet his. I was just focused on work, on making the right connections. The casual dismissal of everything he'd given, everything he'd been, struck him like a slap. James Harrington's wife works in your accounting department, he said quietly. Linda's eyes hardened. You were talking to James Harrington about me? He approached me, actually. Thought it was strange that my wife was ignoring me at her own party. James Harrington is a gossip, Linda said, her voice dismissive. He's just jealous his wife hasn't gotten as far as I have. You shouldn't listen to him. He mentioned you've been having a lot of late dinners with Brighton. Linda let out an exasperated breath. Of course I have. He represents a potential 7-figure account. She threw up her hands. This is exactly why I keep my work life separate from my personal life. You don't understand how business relationships work in my industry. I understand plenty, Paul said, rising from his chair, voice quiet but cutting. I understand that you used to call me when you were running late. That you used to share everything, your meetings, your clients, your hopes. We were partners. Now, I'm just some inconvenient footnote you're trying to manage. Linda's expression softened slightly, the edge in her eyes dulling for a moment. Look, I know I've been distracted. This promotion, it's been all-consuming. But it'll settle down now, I promise. Will it? Paul asked, his voice catching. Because tonight felt like a preview of our future. Me standing alone while you pretend I don't exist. Me waiting at home while you're out with men like Thomas Brighton. Men who look at you like you're more than just a colleague. There's nothing going on with Thomas, Linda said quickly. And yes, I should have mentioned you in my speech. I'm sorry about that. It was an oversight. An oversight, Paul repeated slowly, his voice heavy with disbelief. Like forgetting to pick up milk. You thanked the office manager, Linda. You thanked the caterer. But your husband of 6 years didn't even cross your mind. Linda ran a hand through her hair, tousling the perfect updo. What do you want me to say, Paul? That I'm sorry? Fine, I'm sorry. Can we please go to bed and talk about this tomorrow when we're both less emotional? No, Paul said, surprising them both with the finality in his voice. We can't. Because this isn't just about tonight. It's about the fact that I've become background noise in your life. Useful for keeping the apartment running, for listening to your work problems, but never important enough to be part of your story. That's not fair, Linda said quickly, but there was a flicker of guilt in her eyes that told Paul he'd hit a nerve. He took a step closer, his voice soft but unwavering. When was the last time you asked me about my day? About my job? About anything in my life that wasn't directly tied to yours? Linda opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them, raw and damning. That's what I thought, Paul said finally. I'm going to stay at Michael's for a while. I need space to think. You're leaving? Linda's voice rose, almost disbelieving. Because I didn't thank you in a speech? No, Paul said, his voice low but steady. I'm leaving because tonight made me realize how completely one-sided our marriage has become. And I deserve better than that. He walked past her into the bedroom, pulling a duffel bag from the closet and packing it with quiet determination. Linda hovered in the doorway, her expression shifting from disbelief to alarm. Paul, this is ridiculous, she said, her voice trembling. You can't just leave in the middle of the night because you feel underappreciated. Watch me, he said, zipping the bag closed. What am I supposed to tell people? Linda's voice turned sharp. That my husband threw a tantrum and walked out the night of my promotion? Paul shouldered the bag and met her gaze. Tell them whatever you want. You're good at pretending I don't exist anyway. The words landed like a slap. Linda stepped back, stunned. Paul, wait, she said, grabbing his arm. Please don't do this. Not tonight. This is supposed to be a celebration, not whatever this is. That's the problem, Linda, he said, his voice soft but resolute. It's always about you, your wants, your needs, your convenience. For once, I'm putting myself first. He slipped out of her grasp and walked out, closing the door behind him. 30 minutes later, Paul knocked on his brother Michael's door. Michael answered, immediately alert when he saw Paul's face. What happened? He asked, stepping back to let him in. My marriage might be over, Paul said quietly, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. Michael didn't press. He just led Paul to the guest room and handed him a cold beer. They sat in the kitchen until 3 in the morning, Paul recounting every humiliating detail of the night while Michael listened, his jaw tight with anger. She seriously pretended not to see you? Her own husband? Michael asked finally. More than once, Paul said, voice low. And when I confronted her, she acted like I was being unreasonable. Michael shook his head. That's messed up. And this Brighton guy, do you think there's something going on there? I don't know, Paul said, taking a long drink. Maybe not yet, but the way she looked at him, it was different. Michael slammed his beer down. Even if nothing's happening, the way she treated you tonight, it was wrong. Yeah, Paul said softly, nodding. It was. His phone buzzed again, a third text from Linda, her tone cold and dismissive. This is childish and unnecessary. Please come home so we can talk about this like adults. Paul didn't answer. He closed the phone and took another sip of his beer, the weight of the night finally starting to settle on his shoulders. He turned the phone face down without replying. The next morning, Paul called his office and asked for a personal day, something he almost never did. His supervisor, Dave, sounded concerned but didn't ask questions, just told him to take the time he needed. Paul spent the day helping Michael with a bathroom renovation, grateful for the steady rhythm of tearing down tile and patching drywall. Anything to keep his mind from spiraling. By evening, his phone showed 8 missed calls from Linda and a dozen texts that swung wildly between fury and pleading. The second day of his self-imposed exile, Paul decided to head into the office, even though it was Saturday. The quiet of the weekend was the perfect excuse to catch up on work and avoid her calls. Around noon, the stillness was broken by a familiar voice. "I thought I might find you here." Paul looked up from his screen to see Linda standing by his cubicle, perfectly put together in designer jeans and a cashmere sweater. "How did you know I'd be here?" he asked, voice calm but distant. "You always come to the office when you're upset," she said softly. "It's your safe space." The fact that she knew that detail, a part of him he'd never thought she'd noticed, made his heart ache. "What do you want, Linda?" "I want you to come home," she said, direct and unwavering. "This has gone on long enough." Paul glanced around, conscious of the curious looks from the few colleagues there. "Let's talk outside," he said, rising to lead her to the small courtyard out back. Once they were alone, Linda crossed her arms defensively. "This is ridiculous, Paul. You've made your point. I apologized for not mentioning you in my speech. Can we please move past it?" Her tone, casual, dismissive, reignited the anger he'd been trying to bury. "It's not just about the speech," he said evenly. "It's about how you treated me the entire night. How you've been treating me for months." "I was working," Linda said, her tone clipped. "That event was a crucial networking opportunity." "And I was what?" he said softly. "Just an inconvenient attachment? Someone you hide when the important people are around." Linda had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "That's not fair. You know how important this promotion is to me, to us." "To us?" Paul asked quietly. "You needed to present a certain image, and that image didn't include your husband. Because he's just an accountant." She didn't answer, and her silence was all the confirmation he needed. "You know, it's funny," he continued. "When I was promoted to senior accountant, the first person I thanked was you. Even though you couldn't be there because you had a client dinner." "That's different," Linda said weakly. "Why?" he asked. "Because your career matters more than mine? Because your accomplishments deserve public recognition, but mine are just expected?" He saw the flicker of guilt in her eyes and pressed on. "I've been doing a lot of thinking these past 2 days about partnership, about balance, about what I want from a marriage." And Linda's voice was defensive, but her shoulders had slumped. "And I deserve to be with someone who's proud to be seen with me, who values me, not just as background support, but as an equal partner." Linda's eyes softened. "I do value you, Paul. I know I haven't shown it lately, but I do. And I'm sorry about the party. I was trying so hard to impress Roger and the executive team." "And Thomas Brighton?" Paul said, the name slipping out before he could stop himself. Linda's face went cold. "What about him? Are you sleeping with him?" he asked quietly. Her face flushed with indignation. "How dare you ask me that? That's not a no," Paul said softly. "Of course I'm not sleeping with him," Linda snapped. "He's a potential client, nothing more." "Then why the private dinner at the Westfield?" Paul said, his voice almost a whisper. "Why the lingering touches? Why did James Harrington's wife look at me like she felt sorry for me?" Linda flushed deeper. "Office gossip. Nothing more. I want you to believe me, Paul. But right now, I don't know what to believe anymore," he said honestly. "The Linda I saw at that party, she wasn't the woman I married." "People change," Linda said, her voice tight. "They evolve. Their priorities shift. And I'm not a priority anymore," he said simply. Linda reached for his hand. "That's not true. I love you. I'm just adjusting to this new role, to the expectations that come with it." Paul looked at her hand on his, so familiar and yet suddenly foreign. He remembered how she'd touched Thomas Brighton's arm in the same casual, intimate way. "I need more time," he said finally, gently pulling away. "This isn't something we can fix with one conversation." Linda's face hardened. "How much time?" "Because I have a department to run, a major client to secure, and a husband who's apparently too sensitive to understand how corporate politics work." There it was, the contempt that had been simmering just beneath the surface, now laid bare in her frustration. "Thank you," Paul said quietly. "For what?" Linda asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. for making my decision easier. He stood up from the bench. I'll be by next week to pick up the rest of my things. Please be at work when I come. You're seriously doing this? She said, her voice cracking. Throwing away 6 years of marriage over one bad night. No, Paul said. I'm finally seeing that the marriage I thought we had hasn't existed for a long time. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the courtyard, the cold spring breeze carrying away the last of the words they'd never say again. And I'm choosing to stop pretending otherwise. He turned and walked away, leaving her staring after him in the courtyard. Over the next week, Paul settled into a new routine. He stayed at Michael's, commuting to work and quietly searching for his own apartment. He also began seeing a therapist, something he'd never considered before, but now felt essential to navigating the upheaval in his life. Meanwhile, Linda's messages came in waves, some angry, some pleading. One voicemail, in particular, made him pause. Paul, please. I miss you. The apartment feels empty without you. I know I messed up, and I know it wasn't just the party. Please come home so we can talk. I'll take a day off work. Hell, I'll take a week off if that's what you need. Just don't give up on us without talking. After discussing it with his therapist, Paul agreed to meet her at a neutral spot, a quiet coffee shop halfway between Michael's and their apartment. She was already there when he arrived, seated at a corner table with 2 cups. Dressed simply, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, she looked more like the Linda he'd fallen in love with than the polished executive she'd become. I got your usual, she said as he sat down. Black, 1 sugar. Thanks, he replied, though he didn't reach for the cup. Linda looked tired, the dark circles under her eyes barely concealed by makeup. Thank you for meeting me, she began, her voice careful. I know you probably didn't want to. I think we need closure, one way or another, Paul said, his tone even. Linda flinched at the word. Is that what this is? She asked, her voice small. That depends on you, Paul replied. I've been doing a lot of thinking this past week, and I've realized I don't want to be in a marriage where I'm an afterthought, where I have to beg for basic respect and acknowledgement. I do respect you, Linda protested. Actions speak louder than words, Paul said quietly. And your actions lately have shown me that I'm just an accessory in your life, not a partner. For a moment, Linda was silent, stirring her latte absently. Then she spoke, her voice low. I've been thinking too, about the party, about everything. And I think I've been scared. Terrified, actually. Of not being taken seriously, of people thinking I only got here because of luck or connections instead of talent. And being seen with me would somehow diminish you? Paul's voice cracked, the hurt raw and unguarded. No, she said quickly. Well, not exactly. It's more that I've been so focused on projecting this image, strong, independent, self-made. I was afraid that if I admitted how much I relied on you, it would make my accomplishments seem smaller. So you erased me, Paul said softly. Pretended I didn't exist. Linda swallowed hard. Yes, and it was wrong, so wrong. I see that now. She reached out, leaving her hand resting on the table, close but not quite touching his. What I did hurt you, and I'm so sorry for that. And Thomas Brighton? Paul asked directly. Linda didn't flinch. Nothing has happened. But, she paused, and he heard the truth in her hesitation. I can't honestly say nothing would have happened if we'd kept going the way we were. There was an attraction, an energy. He made me feel powerful, important. And I didn't. Paul asked, his voice breaking. You made me feel loved, Linda said, simply and without hesitation. But somewhere along the way, I started valuing the wrong things. They sat in silence for a long moment, both absorbing her admission. Then Linda took a shaky breath. I canceled the dinner with Thomas. And I asked Diane to take over the Brighton account. Roger agreed. Paul was surprised. That's a big step. It's the right thing to do, Linda said. I've also talked to Roger about restructuring my role to cut down on the late nights, the constant travel. He's seen too many executives lose everything chasing success. He doesn't want that for me either. These are good changes, Paul said cautiously. They are, Linda agreed. But I know they're not enough to fix what's broken between us. What else are you suggesting? Paul asked. Couples counseling. And individual therapy for me, she said. I need to understand why I was willing to risk something real for an illusion of success. Paul took a sip of his coffee, turning her words over in his mind. Words are easy, Linda. Change is hard. I know, she said, finally reaching across to take his hand. That's why I'm not asking you to come home today. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can change, that we can rebuild. What does that look like? Paul asked. Time, she said. 3 months, where we commit to weekly counseling. Structured time together, date nights, real conversations. And if, after 3 months, one or both of us decides it's not working, then we move forward with separation and divorce. Paul finished for her, hearing the catch in her voice. Yes, she said, her eyes brimming but steady. Knowing we truly tried. Paul leaned back, taking it all in. He'd expected her to demand he come home, to brush everything under the rug. But this sounded like she finally understood the depth of what she'd done. He didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. 3 months, he said finally. Starting with a counseling session this week, if we can get an appointment. Relief flooded Linda's face. Thank you, she said, squeezing his hand. I know I don't deserve this chance, but I promise I won't waste it. Paul finally returned the gentle pressure of her fingers, a small but significant gesture of connection. I should be clear. I'm not promising we'll reconcile. I'm promising to honestly try. That's all I'm asking for, Linda assured him. As they finished their coffee and discussed the logistics of their 3-month plan, Paul felt something new. Not the blind optimism he'd felt when they first married, nor the despair that had swallowed him this past week, but a calm certainty that he knew his worth and that he would no longer accept being invisible. Whether their marriage survived or not, he'd never be invisible again. Their first counseling session was raw but productive. Dr. Bennett wasted no time with pleasantries, diving straight into the wounds between them. By the end, they had homework. Linda was to list all the ways Paul's support had helped, not diminished, her success. Paul was to identify times he'd buried his own needs to support Linda's ambitions. In the weeks that followed, they settled into a new rhythm. Tuesday evenings were for counseling. Friday nights were for date nights, no work talk allowed. Sundays were for activities they'd once loved. Hikes, cooking classes, museum visits. Things they'd abandoned as Linda's career consumed everything. 3 weeks into this new chapter, Paul received an unexpected email. A job offer from Harrington Consulting, a firm specializing in financial services for nonprofits. The pay was a little higher, but more importantly, the work aligned with what he truly cared about. He brought it up to Linda during one of their Friday date nights. Her immediate reaction surprised him. You should take it, she said without hesitation. You've always wanted to use your skills to make a difference. You remember that? Paul asked, touched that she'd held on to this detail. Of course I do, Linda said. You told me about it the night we met. How you wanted your work to matter. 2 months into their separation, Linda herself was offered a significant promotion. Executive Vice President of Marketing. More money, more prestige, and more travel, longer hours. She brought it up in a counseling session, her voice uncertain. I wanted to talk to you about it first, she said. This affects both of us, not just me. Paul felt a swell of appreciation for the simple fact that she'd included him in the decision. I'll only take it if we can find a balance, Linda added firmly. No more decisions that leave you out. As the 3-month trial period neared its end, Paul realized something had shifted. He was looking forward to their time together again. Linda had made genuine, steady efforts to change. Not just big gestures, but small, daily choices that showed him he wasn't an afterthought. For the final date of their trial period, Linda suggested they return to the little Italian restaurant where they'd had their first date. I can't believe they're still in business, Paul said with a smile as they were seated at a corner table. I may have been coming here for lunch once in a while, Linda admitted, a shy smile playing at her lips, keeping them afloat single-handedly. They ordered the same dishes they'd shared that first night, spaghetti carbonara for her, lasagna for him, and laughed softly as they reminisced about the early days of their relationship. I've been thinking about next steps, Linda said after a quiet moment. About what happens after tonight. And what have you decided? Paul asked, his heart thumping with a cautious hope. That I want to keep building, she said, her voice steady. Not to pretend everything is perfect, but to create something better than what we had. I want you to come home, Paul. Not because it's easy, but because we can only really heal by living this out together, day by day. Paul thought carefully about her words. These past months had shown him that Linda was capable of change. Not perfect, not complete, but real. I want to come home too, he said at last. but with conditions. Name them, Linda said instantly. We keep going to counseling, at least once a month. We keep our date nights and our weekends. And if the old patterns come back, we deal with it right away, not months down the line. Agreed, Linda said, her eyes unwavering. And I have one condition too. What's that? That you promise to call me out when I'm being self-centered or dismissive. Don't let it fester again. I need you to hold me accountable. Paul gave a small, wry smile. That might be the biggest change of all, actually wanting to hear when you're wrong. Linda laughed softly, tears bright in her eyes. Terrifying, isn't it? But necessary. 3 weeks later, they attended a charity event where Linda represented Crestview. Unlike the promotion party that had torn them apart, this time she kept Paul by her side, introducing him with obvious pride. This is my husband, Paul, she said with a warm smile. He's just taken a new position at Harrington Consulting, working with nonprofits. Paul noticed how she highlighted his role, ensuring he was seen as a professional in his own right. It was a small but powerful sign of how far they'd come. As the evening wound down, Linda was asked to say a few words on behalf of Crestview, one of the event's major sponsors. She stepped to the microphone with the same polished confidence she'd always had. But when she began to speak, Paul saw something different in her eyes, a genuine openness, a willingness to share the credit, to honor the people behind the scenes. And this time, she didn't forget him. Community has always been at the heart of Crestview's mission, she began, her voice warm and clear. And I've learned recently that community begins at home, with the people who stand beside us, day in and day out. Her eyes found Paul in the crowd, and she smiled, a quiet, radiant smile meant just for him. My husband, Paul, taught me that lesson, that our greatest accomplishments aren't solo endeavors. They're built on love, support, and true partnership. The applause rose around them, but what Paul felt went deeper than the sound of clapping hands. Linda's words weren't just a performance. They were real, a reflection of the woman she was working so hard to become. He felt a steady warmth in his chest, not because she'd acknowledged him publicly, but because he believed her. The charity event was different from that promotion party in every way that mattered. Linda wasn't just playing a part tonight. She was present, genuine, fully aware of the people who mattered most. On Monday, she was scheduled to meet with Thomas Brighton to finalize the marketing campaign she and Diane had crafted. Paul found himself curious, not anxious, about how she would handle it, now that she'd set her boundaries so clearly. As they pulled into their driveway, Linda's phone buzzed with an email. Her expression tightened as she read it. What is it? Paul asked. It's from Brighton, Linda said, her voice calm but resolute. He wants to have dinner instead of meeting at the office. Says he prefers a more relaxed atmosphere for creative discussions. And what are you going to tell him? Paul asked, his voice even. Linda hesitated for only a moment before typing quickly and hitting send. I told him I'm only available for office meetings during business hours, and that Diane will be joining, since she's managing the account now. Paul felt a surge of pride, not because she was seeking his approval. She wasn't. She was standing up for herself, for them, for what they were rebuilding together. It might cost you that 7-figure account, he said quietly. Maybe, Linda said with a small, steady shrug. But some things are worth more than an account.